What's up everyone, it's DevBird here, and in today's episode we are going to do sprite layering. So I'm gonna play our game, and I have this little shelf here, and you'll notice that if I go up to it, see I'm in front of it, that's fine, that's what we want. If I try to go behind it, and now I'm on top of it, and I don't want to be on top of it. What I want to happen is I want to go behind this object, but my sprite is being rendered on top. So how do we fix this problem? Well, we have to understand what exactly we're trying to do. So here I have this little example in MS Paint so I can draw on, but we're trying to put this rendered shelf above or behind the character. And the way we do that is by changing, let me just rename this to shelf. The way we do that is by changing the sorting layer. So right now it's on default and we don't have many layers. We'll add some later, but right now our character is on the player layer, and if I change it to player layer and make this like 5 or something, or just a number above 0 because our player is on the 0th layer, it'll go above the player, which is what we want. But how do we do this through code? Because obviously you're not just going to manually change this every time. You need to go above or behind something. You have to do it through code. So we have to understand what the conditions are. And the condition, if we notice, when we want to change the order in layer, is dependent on the Y position of the character in relation to the object. So if my player is down here, I want him to be, I want the cabinet or the shelf to be behind the player. And if my player is up here, then I'm going to change that to be in front of the player. So we know that the condition is whether the player is above or below the shelf, but what does that mean exactly? What we're actually just doing is comparing the Y value of this shelf to our player. So if our Y value of our player is greater or less than the shelf, then we're going to do something. We're going to move the shelf back or in front of the player in the layers, which rhymes. But so you might be wondering, why aren't we changing the layering of the player? Wouldn't that be easier to just move him up and down instead of like all the objects in our game? Well, the problem is that all the objects in the game are gonna fight with each other and trying to move the player's layer positioning, and he's gonna go like back and forth rapidly, and it's not gonna look very good. So now that we understand that we're trying to compare two values, the Y value specifically, let's try to do some coding and do some layering. Well, actually, first we should probably do the layering. Getting layering established. So we have this one layer called player layer, and we're going to add a sorting layer. We're going to click here, add to list, and we're going to call this layer the foreground. And then we'll call this the background. And it's not set up properly, so you got to move the background up and above the player layer. So now if we check in our shelf, or whatever object you can use, it doesn't have to be a shelf, obviously. Use whatever object to test this. Now if we click on the sorting layer, you'll see background, player layer, and foreground. And so now, if I click on foreground, the shelf will appear above the player, and if I click on background, it's going to go behind the player. And cool, so we're going to be shifting between these two layers. And now let's open up some code. We're going to make a script. We'll put it in utility, sure, why not? We'll put it in, or we'll call it layering. And we'll open it up. Alright, so we have our layering script here. And we don't need any of this. There's actually one thing we need to do first, and we need to create another script and call it interactable proximity. And you might be wondering, like, alright, well, we already have an interactable script. Why do we need this? So the reason why we need this script is because we need to know if our player is in range, because there's no reason to know why this object should go back or forward a layer. If our player is like in another world, right? What if our player is just like all the way over here or something? You know, the shelf is irrelevant. So we need to know if our player is in range of like a certain radius. And we already done that, right? We already have that in, it's called the interactable script, but our interactable script requires us to press Z. So we pretty much need the interactable script but without the Z part. So we're just gonna like copy paste this code, really. That's all we're gonna need to do. And then we're just gonna get rid of this Z part. I think that's a little better. And so with just that, we have the pretty much the exact same thing, except that we don't need to press Z anymore. This will fire off whenever our player is. Oops, I actually have this in the wrong script. I want it to be in the proximity script. You get out of here. I would put in my layering script by accident. So put this in the right script, the proximity script, and then you can derive the layering script from the interactable proximity script. And now we know when our player is in range of the object, and we can fire off code without requiring the player to press Z. Okay, so what are we going to do here? So what we're going to do is create a public override void interact. So we're overriding our interact script, and we're going to be putting in custom logic whenever our player is in range of the object. Alright, so we need to know if our player's position is less than or greater than the Y position of the object. So just say if GameObject dot transform dot position dot y is less than our player's position. And the way we get our player position, we already have it in our game manager if you followed along the last video or maybe the video prior to this. But we can get our player position by doing that. Transform.y .position.y. And so you see here, we're just checking if the game object, so this game object, though you don't really need this to be honest, this will actually be perfectly fine without it, because it automatically assumes that you're trying to get the transform of the game object it's attached to. So you can have game object or you can take it out, it's really the same thing. Transform the position of this object, the Y position specifically, and you're checking if it's less than the player's position dot Y. Now that we've done this check to see if our object's Y position is less than the player's Y position, we can now set the sprite to a certain layer. But we need the actual sprite renderer. So we're going to go sprite renderer. And we'll call this, well, we'll just call it sprite renderer. and we'll go start, and then we'll say sprite renderer equal to get component sprite renderer. Cool. And now we can actually change the sprite renderer's layer. So we'll say sprite renderer, then we'll say sorting layer name is equal to foreground. Now you have to make sure that the name that you put in here is exactly the same name as the layer. It has to be, it's case sensitive, so you have to put all the capital and the same thing, so make sure all the capitalization is the same. Here we go. So I have foreground, and here I have foreground. There's also a way you can like make sure it's the same by going to add layer, and then you can just click on here and hit copy, Control C, and then just go back and just Control V to make sure. So this is 100% the same. And now we have to get the, now we have to see if the Y position is greater than the player's Y position. Well, we actually don't even have to like put it in. We can just say else, because if it's not less than the player's Y position, then the only other option is for it to be greater than, right? So then we can just say sprite renderer dot sorting layer name is equal to background. And that's it. That's all we have to do. And so let's attach this script onto our game object. So it does require you to put the layering script onto every object that you need it to be on. But you'll come to see that you don't need it on all your objects, and so that way you save a little bit of computing power. And let's see if it works. And there should be a problem. Well, actually, this one actually works just fine. So we see if we click, or you already see it clicked here, but pay attention to the sorting layer. See how it moves from foreground to background. And so that's how you can have your player be in front of objects and then go behind objects too. But there actually is a problem, just that this one's pretty good at doing it. But let me get rid of the box collider and show you a potential problem. So the exact spot at where I go behind the object is going to be different for every object, because every object is going to be unique, right? Some objects are gonna have a different point at which you want it to be behind this object. So let me just find a different object for a better example. So let me get this tree, drag it in, put the layering script on it. And I go behind this tree when I'm all the way up here, which is not what I want. I want to be behind this object when I'm like right here or something. So it's based off of the pivot point of the sprite versus the pivot point of your character. So the pivot point of my character is probably in the center somewhere. You can change it to be a little bit lower if you want. But we're primarily going to want to change the pivot point of our tree or rear object. And so if we see here, this little blue circle is your pivot point. And you can change it by either dragging it, or you can go down to the bottom right here to change it, Or you can go over here and see the pivot center. You say bottom, or it's just bottom here. For some reason, if you go here, it's bottom center. So I don't know why they have it like that. But now our tree's pivot point is at the bottom of our tree. And you'll know for sure if you try to rotate your tree, it'll rotate at the pivot. And so that should help it a little bit. But now I'm going behind the tree too soon. And so how can we remedy this? We can remedy this by adding an offset. So we'll say a public float and call this offset. And then we're just going to add, say plus offset, and that's all we need to do. And so we can just add an offset to this, and then we'll play, and then we can adjust the offset to what we need exactly. And so let's say, let's move this around a little bit. Now it's too high, so we can lower this a little bit. And yeah, that works. That seems to work. I'm going behind and in front of the tree the precise moment that I want it to be. And so the thing is, when you're in play mode, it doesn't save your offsets, or it doesn't save anything in general. So you have to hit Control C to save it, and then it's going to go back to 0, then hit Control V, and now it's the way we want it to be. Let me just do this real quick. And there you go. That's how you do sprite layering. That's all the code you need. And it'll make your player go behind and in front of objects. And if it's not quite right, you can change the offset to be exactly where you want it to be. And also, you should probably change the pivot to be at the bottom. If you have like a big object, smaller objects, it's fine because you like slightly change the offset. But for bigger objects, you'll have to like change the offset a lot. So maybe it's better to just change the pivot first. But either way, it doesn't really matter. And so that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys next time. I'd like to thank my Patreons, Alejandro, Kovian, Bay, Emerson, Kirijo, Polybius, and Yoan. If you want to become a Patreon, you can support me at patreon.com/devbird, where you can join my Discord, or you can just join the Discord in the link description below. And there you can suggest videos or ask me questions, and I'll see you guys next time.